The glass shattered against the floorboards, a sound as sharp and final as a bone breaking. It was the third one that week. Lynn flinched, her body already coiling in anticipation of the blow. The air in Croft's saloon was always thick with the smell of stale whiskey, wet wool, and regret. But tonight, a bitter cold seeped through the walls, making the stench even fouler. Her cough had been getting worse, a dry, rattling thing that shook her thin frame and made her vision swim. Sickness was a liability, and Mr. Croft did not tolerate liabilities. He was a man built of hard angles and harder resentments, his face a permanent scowl. He moved from behind the bar, his heavy boots making the floorboards groan. The patrons, a grim collection of trappers and failed prospectors, fell silent, their eyes gleaming with the cruel curiosity of men watching a dog get kicked. Lynn kept her gaze fixed on the glittering shards of glass swimming in a puddle of spilled beer. To look up was to invite a worse punishment. "Pick it up." Croft's voice was a low growl, a rusty nail scraping across stone. Her hands trembled as she knelt, the rough wood digging into her knees through the thin gray fabric of her dress. Each shard she gathered was a tiny, cold star of pain promising a larger, hotter one to come. "You cost me money, girl. Every time you breathe, you cost me money." His shadow fell over her, a suffocating blanket. She could feel the heat of his rage, smell the sourness on his breath. He believed he owned her, her labor, her pain, her very breath. He had paid for her passage, a debt he reminded her of with his fists and his belt every time she faltered. She dropped a piece of glass, and his patience, always a sliver-thin thing, snapped entirely. His hand shot out, grabbing a fistful of her dark hair, and yanked her head back. A cry tore from her throat, raw and involuntary. "Too sick to work? I'll give you something to be sick about." His other hand rose and she closed her eyes, a familiar litany of terror and resignation washing over her. But the blow never landed. A different sound cut through the charged silence of the saloon. The scrape of a chair leg against the floor, deliberate and loud. "That's enough." The voice was quiet, yet it commanded the entire room. It was flat, devoid of emotion, but carried a weight that made the air feel heavy. Lynn dared to open her eyes. A man stood by a table in the corner, a man she'd noticed before but never truly seen. He was tall and broad, dressed in worn buckskin, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He wasn't a brawler or a drunk. He was just there, still, like a mountain. Croft, still holding her hair, turned his scowl on the stranger. "This ain't your business, rancher. Move on." The man, Amos, didn't move. He just looked at Croft, his eyes dark and unreadable. "I said, that's enough." He placed a few coins on the table. "For the girl's debt. And the broken glass." Croft's eyes narrowed, flicking from the coins to Lynn, a sneer twisting his lips. He saw only property, a transaction. He shoved Lynn forward and she stumbled, catching herself on the edge of a table. "Take the broken thing, then. She's no good to me." Amos didn't look at her. His focus remained entirely on Croft, a silent warning passing between them. He walked toward the door, his movements economical and sure. He paused, his back to the room. "Come on." It wasn't a question or a plea. It was a simple statement of fact, like saying the sun would rise. For a moment, Lynn was frozen, caught between the familiar monster and the terrifying unknown. But then she saw the open door, the swirl of snow in the darkness beyond. It was a choice, maybe the only one she'd ever had. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the searing pain in her knee and the mocking laughter from the bar, and ran. The blizzard hit her like a solid wall, the wind screaming, stealing the air from her lungs. But it was clean, cold and clean. Amos was already untying his horse, a big, steady beast that stood unbothered by the storm. He pulled a heavy oilskin coat from his saddle roll and threw it over her shoulders without a word. It smelled of pine and leather and snow. He mounted the horse and reached a hand down to her. His grip was strong, firm, pulling her up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in the rough fabric of his coat, and the world dissolved into a blinding chaos of white. The journey was a blur of biting wind and suffocating snow. Lynn clung to the solid warmth of the man in front of her, the only anchor in a world that had dissolved into a howling, frozen void. The cold was a physical entity, a predator with teeth of ice that gnawed at her through the layers of wool and oilskin. Her cough returned, a deep, ragged tearing in her chest that left her dizzy and weak. She didn't know how long they rode, hours or an eternity. The rhythmic sway of the horse, the steady presence of Amos, and the roar of the storm were all that existed. Just when she thought the cold would finally consume her, would freeze the very blood in her veins, the horse slowed. Through the swirling snow, a faint, golden light appeared, a single window, a beacon of impossible warmth. They had arrived at a small, isolated cabin tucked into a stand of old-growth pines, the trees themselves hunched against the wind like weary giants. Amos slid off the horse and lifted her down, his hands gentle but firm. Her legs buckled, numb and useless, and he caught her, half carrying her to the heavy wooden door. The moment he pushed it open, the warmth washed over her, a staggering physical relief. It was a small, one-room space, but it was clean and orderly. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a healthy fire crackling within, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn log walls. A simple cot lay in one corner, a sturdy table and 2 chairs in the center. It was a place of quiet solitude, a world away from the noise and filth of the saloon. He led her to a chair near the fire, and she sank into it, her body trembling uncontrollably now that the immediate danger had passed. Amos moved with a quiet efficiency, stoking the fire, then ladling steaming broth from a pot that hung over the flames. He placed the warm bowl in her hands. Her fingers were so numb she could barely feel the heat, but she clutched it like a prayer. He said nothing, simply moved back to tend to his horse, giving her space. The silence in the cabin was as profound as the storm's roar had been. It was a living thing, a silence that felt safe. She sipped the broth, the hot liquid a balm to her raw throat, and watched him. He moved with a kind of contained stillness, a man who had pared his life down to the essentials. He was haunted by something. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way his eyes never seemed to rest for long. But there was no cruelty in him, only a deep, abiding weariness. He brought her a thick wool blanket and draped it over her shoulders. "You're safe here," he said, his voice the same low rumble as before. "No one will bother you." He gestured to the cot. "Get some rest." He then took a second blanket and settled into the chair on the other side of the hearth, turning his gaze to the fire as if to stand watch over her sleep. For the first time in years, Lynn lay down without fear. The fire crackled, the wind howled outside the sturdy walls, and she drifted into an exhausted, dreamless sleep, wrapped in the warmth of a stranger's kindness. The first few days were a quiet rhythm of healing. The storm raged on, encasing the small cabin in a world of white, a fortress of snow and silence that kept the rest of the world at bay. Lynn slept more than she had in years, a deep, restorative sleep, punctuated by fits of coughing that slowly began to ease. Amos was a constant, unobtrusive presence. He would leave a bowl of broth or a plate of stewed rabbit on the table for her when she woke, the fire always banked and warm. He moved about the cabin with a practiced economy, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor. He never pressed her for conversation, never asked what had happened to her, though the fading bruises on her face and the scars on her arms told their own story. He treated her not as a burden or a curiosity, but as a person deserving of quiet dignity. This gentle respect was more healing than any medicine. Slowly she began to move around the small space, her body aching but growing stronger. She would fold the blankets on her cot, her movements stiff and careful. She washed the bowls in a basin of heated water, the simple domestic act feeling foreign and profound. He would watch her sometimes, his expression unreadable, before turning back to mending a piece of tack or sharpening a knife. The silence between them was no longer the empty, watchful silence of the first night. It had softened, becoming a comfortable space filled with unspoken understanding. One afternoon, as she sat by the fire, mending a tear in her thin dress with a needle and thread he had left on the table, he spoke. "There's more fabric in that chest," he said, nodding toward a wooden trunk at the foot of his own sleeping roll, "and warmer clothes, if you want them." She looked up, surprised. He met her gaze for only a second before looking back at the piece of leather he was working. The offer was simple, practical, yet it felt like a monumental gift. It was an acknowledgment of her presence, of her future beyond this immediate moment of recovery. The next morning she opened the chest. Inside, folded neatly, were flannel shirts and sturdy wool trousers. They were men's clothes, his clothes, but they were clean and warm. She chose a dark blue flannel shirt, the fabric soft against her skin, the sleeves too long. Rolling them up, she felt a strange sense of being both protected and anonymous, shedding the gray, tattered skin of her old life. When Amos came back inside from checking his trap lines, his arms full of firewood, he stopped for a moment, his eyes taking in the sight of her in his shirt. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, and then continued on with his task. A silent approval, a silent acceptance. In that small, quiet cabin, surrounded by a world of snow, a fragile trust was being built. One bowl of soup, one shared silence, one small act of kindness at a time. It was a language without words, a slow, careful mending of two broken souls. As the storm finally broke and a pale, watery sun illuminated the snow-covered landscape, a new routine began to form. The world outside the window was a pristine, blinding expanse of white, beautiful and deadly in its isolation. Lynn found herself watching Amos as he went about his daily tasks, his competence a quiet marvel. He moved through the deep snow with an ease that spoke of long familiarity, his powerful frame cutting a path to the woodpile or the small, half-buried lean-to where he kept his supplies. He never wasted a motion. Every swing of the axe was precise, every step deliberate. He was a man who had learned to survive by stripping away everything that was not essential, and she wondered what sorrows had forced such a stark discipline upon him. She began to take on more tasks herself, her strength slowly returning. She kept the fire fed, the cabin tidy. She learned to bake a dense, heavy bread in the cast-iron pot nestled in the coals, the smell filling their small home with a comforting aroma. One day he brought back a rabbit from his traps, and without a word, laid it on the table with a knife. He watched her, a silent question in his eyes. She hesitated for only a moment before nodding. She knew how to do this. It was a skill from a life before the saloon, a life she rarely allowed herself to remember. Her hands, though still marked by old scars, moved with a forgotten deftness. Amos watched her clean and prepare the rabbit, his expression thoughtful. He had seen the fragility, the fear. Now he was seeing the resilience. It was a subtle shift in their dynamic. She was no longer just a victim he had rescued. She was a partner in this small, isolated world they shared. The long evenings were the quietest time. They would sit on opposite sides of the hearth, the fire crackling between them. Sometimes he would read from a small, well-worn book, his voice a low murmur that was more a comforting sound than a story she followed. Other times, they would simply sit in silence, watching the flames. It was in these moments that she would catch glimpses of the man behind the stoic facade, a flicker of pain in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his hand would sometimes clench into a fist for no apparent reason. He was a man at war with his own ghosts, and his self-imposed exile in this remote cabin was his battleground. One evening she nearly dropped a hot pan, and he moved with startling speed to catch it, his hand brushing hers. The contact was brief, a fleeting warmth, but it sent a jolt through her. It was the first time they had touched since he pulled her onto his horse. He pulled his hand back as if burned, his face a mask of control, but she had seen it, a flicker of longing, of a loneliness as profound as her own. One night the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters and moaning in the chimney. The sound was mournful, a reminder of the world's harshness just beyond their warm walls. The fire cast long, dancing shadows that made the small cabin feel both intimate and vast. Lynn was nursing a mug of hot tea, the warmth seeping into her hands. She looked over at Amos, who was staring into the flames, his face etched with a familiar, deep-seated sorrow. The question had been sitting on her tongue for weeks, a small, heavy stone. Tonight it felt light enough to speak. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you help me?" He didn't look at her. For a long time the only sounds were the fire and the wind. She thought he wouldn't answer, that she had broken the careful peace between them. But then he spoke, his voice rough with disuse. "Because I didn't help someone else once." He finally turned his head, and his eyes met hers in the flickering light. They were filled with a bleakness that stole her breath. "A long time ago, I was younger, prouder. I saw a man, much like Croft, treating a stable boy badly. I told myself it wasn't my business. I walked away." He paused, his gaze dropping back to the fire as if the memory were playing out in the flames. "They found the boy the next morning. He hadn't survived the night. I saw the man responsible a week later, laughing in a saloon, just like that one." He fell silent, but the story hung in the air, heavy and cold. It wasn't an excuse or a plea for admiration. It was a confession, a stark, unvarnished admission of a failure that had shaped the rest of his life. He had intervened for her, not because he was a hero, but because he was a man living with the ghost of a boy he had failed to save. The weight of his guilt was a tangible thing in the small room. Lynn felt her own story rising in her throat, not the story of Croft and the beatings, but the one before it. "My father was a scholar," she said softly, surprising herself. "He taught me to read. He said words were bridges between people. He saved all his money to send me here, to my uncle in a city he'd only read about in letters. He thought it was a better life." She traced a pattern on her warm mug. "His bridge led me to a dead end. My uncle had died. The man who met me at the docks took my money, my papers, and he sold me to Mr. Croft." It was the most she had spoken of her past to anyone. Sharing her own broken bridge felt like the only possible response to his story of a ghost. He looked at her then, and the distance between them seemed to vanish. In its place was a shared understanding, a recognition of mirrored wounds. He wasn't just her rescuer, and she wasn't just his ward. They were two people haunted by the cruelty of the world, who had found a momentary, fragile sanctuary in each other's presence. That night, the silence that returned was different. It was deeper, richer, a space no longer defined by what was unsaid, but by what was finally understood. A month after the blizzard, their supplies began to run low. Salt, flour, coffee, the small necessities that made life in the cabin bearable. Amos knew he had to make the trip to the nearest settlement, a place called Dustwood Creek, a full day's ride away. A palpable tension entered the cabin at the prospect of his departure. The sanctuary they had built felt fragile, its walls only as strong as their isolation. "I'll be back by nightfall tomorrow," he assured her, his voice low. "Keep the door barred. Don't answer it for anyone." Lynn simply nodded, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. The thought of being alone, even for a day, was terrifying. The world outside the cabin was still the world of men like Croft. She watched him saddle his horse in the cold morning light, his movements as efficient and deliberate as always. He paused before mounting, turning to look at her as she stood in the doorway. "You'll be all right, Lynn," he said, using her name for the first time. It sounded strange and solid in the crisp air. The journey to Dustwood Creek was uneventful, but the settlement itself set Amos on edge. It was little more than a muddy street lined with a general store, a blacksmith, and a saloon that looked even grimmer than Croft's. As he tied his horse outside the store, he saw it, a piece of paper nailed to a post, stark against the weathered wood. It was a reward notice. His blood ran cold for a second, thinking his own past had finally caught up to him. But as he drew closer, he saw it wasn't his face on the paper. It was a crude drawing, but the description was unmistakable. A young Chinese woman, last seen at Croft's saloon. A generous reward for her return. The paper called her runaway property. While he was reading, two men stepped out of the saloon. One was a bounty hunter Amos recognized by reputation, a man named Fletcher, known for his relentless and brutal methods. Fletcher was lean and wiry, with eyes like chips of ice. "Looking for work, friend?" Fletcher asked, a smirk playing on his thin lips as he gestured toward the poster. "Easy money. Croft's offering a bonus for the man who brings her back, and an extra bonus for the hide of whoever helped her run." Amos kept his face impassive, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He just shook his head. "Not my line of work." He turned and went into the general store, his mind racing. Croft wasn't just angry, he was vengeful, and he had hired a wolf to do his hunting. Amos bought his supplies quickly, his senses on high alert. The ride home was a race against the setting sun and the growing dread in his gut. The sanctuary was no longer a secret. The outside world, with all its greed and cruelty, was coming for them. He saw the tracks about a mile from his cabin. A single horse, shod, moving with purpose. Fletcher was already closing in. He burst into the cabin just as dusk was bleeding across the snow, his urgency a stark contrast to his usual calm. Lynn jumped, her hand flying to her throat, the fear he had seen in her on the first night returning to her eyes. "He knows," Amos said, his voice grim as he barred the door behind him. "Croft posted a reward. A bounty hunter is in the area. I saw his tracks not far from here." He dropped the sack of supplies on the table, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden, tense silence. The fragile peace of their sanctuary shattered. The howling wind outside was no longer just weather. It was the sound of a predator closing in. Lynn's face went pale, her eyes wide with a terror that was old and familiar. The thought of being dragged back to Croft, to that life of daily degradation and pain, was a physical sickness. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Amos didn't answer immediately. He walked to the wall where his rifle rested on two wooden pegs. He took it down, his movements methodical, a stark and terrible purpose in his hands. He checked the action, his knuckles white. This was the one thing he had tried to leave behind, the skill he possessed for taking a life. The violence he had kept caged within himself for years was now stirring, awakened by this new threat. He had built this quiet life as a penance, a way to keep the monster of his past locked away. But now, that monster was the only thing that could protect her. He turned to face her, the rifle held loosely in his hands. "He's not taking you back, Lynn," he said, and it was a vow, a promise sealed with the cold weight of the steel in his grip. "This ends here." In that moment, the last of the distance between them dissolved. The shared fear, the grim determination on his face, forged a new, more powerful bond. She walked over to him, her fear not gone, but overshadowed by a fierce, protective instinct of her own. She reached out and placed her hand over his on the rifle's wooden stock. His hand was tense, the muscles coiled like springs. Her touch was a small, steady pressure. "We," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "we will face him." He looked down at her hand on his, then up into her eyes. He saw not a frightened victim, but a woman of incredible strength, a woman who had survived the unthinkable and was refusing to be broken. He saw a partner. A small, sad smile touched his lips. He had rescued her from a saloon, but she was the one rescuing him from his self-imposed prison of guilt. He had a reason to fight, not just against his past, but for a future with her. He gave her hand a slight squeeze before letting go, his resolve hardening into something unbreakable. They waited, the fire crackling, the wind screaming, the silence inside the cabin a taut wire about to snap. The sound came just after midnight, a soft thud against the outside wall, like a clump of snow falling from a branch. But it was too deliberate. Amos was instantly on his feet, the rifle in his hands, his body a study in lethal stillness. He motioned for Lynn to get down, away from the single window. She crouched behind the heavy wooden table, her heart hammering against her ribs. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. It was a waiting silence, heavy with threat. Then a voice cut through the wind, low and taunting. "I know you're in there, rancher, and I know you've got Croft's property with you. Make it easy. Send the girl out, and I might just let you walk away." It was Fletcher. Amos remained silent, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the cabin, his ears straining for any sound of movement. He would not be baited. The front door was their only way in or out. Fletcher would have to come through it. "Have it your way," the voice drawled, followed by the crunch of boots in the snow moving toward the door. There was a sudden, splintering crash as the heel of a boot slammed into the wood near the latch. Then another. The heavy bar Amos had set in place groaned, but held. A furious curse from outside, then a different sound, the scrape of something being dragged. A moment later, a heavy log, used as a makeshift battering ram, slammed into the door. The wood splintered, the bar cracking under the strain. Lynn pressed her hands over her mouth to stifle a cry. Amos moved to the side of the door, pressing his back against the log wall, becoming one with the shadows. The ram hit again, and this time the bar shattered. The door flew open, revealing the dark shape of Fletcher, a pistol in his hand, framed against the moonlit snow. He stepped inside, his eyes quickly adjusting to the dim firelight, a predator's grin on his face. "Now, that wasn't so hard, was it?" He saw Lynn huddled behind the table. "There you are. Mr. Croft will be so pleased." He took a step toward her, his pistol raised. He never saw Amos. From the shadows, Amos moved, not with the rifle, but with his body. He slammed into Fletcher, driving him back against the doorframe. The pistol discharged, the shot deafening in the small cabin, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the ceiling. The gun flew from Fletcher's hand, skittering across the floor. The two men were a tangle of desperate, brutal force. Fletcher was wiry and fast, a knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. He slashed wildly, cutting a deep gash in Amos's arm. Amos grunted in pain but didn't back down. He grabbed Fletcher's wrist, their faces inches apart, their breath misting in the cold air. "She's not property," Amos snarled, a raw, primal rage in his voice. He twisted Fletcher's wrist until the knife clattered to the floor. Using his size and weight, he forced the bounty hunter to the ground. Fletcher was still fighting, kicking, spitting, a cornered animal. Amos saw the hate in his eyes, the same transactional cruelty he'd seen in Croft. He knew Fletcher would never stop. He would hunt them forever. The choice was simple, and it was terrible. The ghosts he'd been running from screamed in his mind. But a new voice, Lynn's voice, whispered of a future. He made his choice. It was swift, brutal, and silent. And then it was over. In the ringing silence that followed, the only sounds were the crackling fire and Amos's own ragged breathing. He stood over Fletcher's still form, his chest heaving, the adrenaline draining away to leave a cold, sick dread in its place. He looked at his hands, spattered with blood, and they began to tremble violently. The man he had kept locked away, the man capable of this, was free. The ghosts of his past were no longer memories. They were here, in this room, joined by a new one. A wave of nausea and self-loathing washed over him so powerfully that his knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, his back sliding down the rough log wall. He dropped his head into his hands, the tremors shaking his entire body. He had done it. He had killed again. He had broken the one rule he had set for his penance, the vow that he would never again take a life, no matter the reason. The sanctuary was desecrated, not by the intruder, but by him. He heard a soft movement and looked up. Lynn was emerging from behind the table, her eyes wide, fixed not on the body on the floor, but on him. He expected to see fear or revulsion. He had shown her the monster inside him. He deserved her disgust. But as she came closer, kneeling in front of him, he saw neither. Her expression was filled with a fierce, heartbreaking compassion. She gently took his trembling hands in hers, her touch steady and warm against his cold skin. He tried to pull away, ashamed of the blood on them, but she held firm. "Amos," she said, her voice soft but clear in the heavy silence. "Look at me." He forced himself to meet her gaze. Tears were tracking paths through the grime on her cheeks, but she was not crying for Fletcher or for herself. She was crying for him. "You saved me," she whispered, her thumbs gently stroking the backs of his hands. "That man, he was not a man. He was a cage, and you broke it." She saw the act not as a murder, but as a liberation. She reframed his terrible choice not as a fall from grace, but as an act of ultimate protection, of selfless love. She saw the cost, the wound it had inflicted on his soul, and instead of recoiling, she moved closer to help him bear it. She took a corner of her sleeve and carefully, tenderly, began to wipe the blood from his hands. The simple, intimate act was more powerful than any words. It was absolution. It was acceptance. In that moment, their roles were fully reversed. He had saved her body from Croft, and now she was saving his soul from his own ghosts. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers, and finally let the tremors subside, anchoring himself to the small, steady warmth of the woman who had seen the worst of him and had not turned away. They buried him at dawn, a grim and silent task. They wrapped the body in an old canvas tarp and carried it deep into the woods, to a place where the pines grew thick and the snow lay undisturbed. Amos dug the grave, his movements mechanical, the gash on his arm a dull, throbbing reminder of the night's violence. Lynn stood watch, a silent sentinel against the cold gray light. They said no words over the unmarked grave, for there were none to say. The act was a final, somber closing of a chapter, a burying of the outside world's claim on them. When they returned to the cabin, the rising sun was casting a pale golden light over the snow, making it gleam. The world felt scrubbed clean, new. Inside, the signs of the struggle were a stark violation of their sanctuary. Amos methodically repaired the broken door, his hands sure and steady now. Lynn cleaned the floor, erasing the last traces of the intrusion, her movements filled with a quiet determination. They were not just cleaning the cabin, they were reclaiming it. They were rebuilding their world, board by board, memory by memory. As the weeks turned into months, the deep snows of winter began to recede, giving way to the soft, tentative green of spring. The world outside their window transformed. The creek, frozen solid for months, began to thaw and sing its rushing song. Birds returned to the pines, their calls filling the morning air. The change was mirrored within the cabin. The heavy silence of winter healing gave way to easier companionship. They began to talk more, sharing small stories of their pasts, their voices weaving a new history together in the small space. One day, Amos started building a small porch onto the front of the cabin. Lynn watched him work, the rhythmic sound of his hammer a comforting, steady heartbeat. When he was done, she brought out 2 chairs, and they sat together in the evenings, watching the sun set behind the mountains, the air smelling of damp earth and new life. She planted a small garden near the porch, her hands in the rich soil. She planted herbs and hardy vegetables, things that would sustain them. It was an act of faith, a belief in a future. It was putting down roots. One evening, as they sat on the new porch, a comfortable silence settled between them. Amos reached over and took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm, and her fingers fit perfectly between his. It wasn't a gesture of rescue or comfort. It was a gesture of simple, profound belonging. "I am glad you are here, Lynn," he said, his voice quiet. "This place. It was just a shelter before. Now it's a home." She squeezed his hand, her heart full. "I am home," she replied. They had faced the ghosts of the past and the monsters of the world, and they had chosen each other. They had built a life not out of grand declarations, but out of small, steady acts of care, courage, and resilience. A story like this, about finding a safe harbor in the storm, is a reminder that everyone deserves a place to heal, a place to be seen, a place to call home. If their journey from darkness into light moved you, consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue to share stories of hope and redemption, proving that even after the harshest winter, spring always returns.